And why that's important is the worldviews is a lot of worldviews underpinning a lot of the systems work. How individuals and societies construct our reality, the beliefs, our assumptions about how we see and interpret the world. If we believe the world is all about conflict, what does that do? If we believe the world is made up of circles, what does that do to our thinking? They shape what we think is possible and what we do. And that's even today, like the piece of work I was looking at was like, how do we break out of the idea of learning as a linear pathway? You know, what if learning isn't a linear pathway? What if it's a circle pathway? How does that change our worldview? You know, Indigenous knowledge doesn't think about development in a linear way. So what does that mean for how we design our curriculum at school? That was just my piece of work and the work that I was trying to engage with this afternoon. So worldviews, how do they construct our reality? Why is it important? Worldviews affect our relationships, how we see relationships, how we see power dynamics, how we see the decisions we make, the practices, the policies, the resources flow. And this follows very similar models to things that we have in the iceberg model in systems thinking. You know, very much at the bottom of this is the mental models. But I quite like this image, which I think my colleague Sean helped with as well, the idea that we ricochet into the world through the way we think about it. And so this is why bringing the living systems perspective is important, because it can affect how we might understand these other elements in the system and the other things that we're looking at. And what I want to say is that a lot of our current paradigm, a lot of the worldview, and I'll use that word slightly interchangeably, the paradigm or the worldview, the set of beliefs and values, is dominated in the Western world, and I'll say that purposefully in the place that I'm standing here, London in particular. We have a very Newtonian paradigm. It's not as the only, but as a dominant, a way of seeing where everything describes the result in a linear cause and effect. Okay? And this affects how we manage, how we create change, how we act in the world. And it's been very useful. It's been a very useful paradigm as well. It helps us create efficiencies and clarities and helps us have progress. Perhaps I've been doing this piece of work on the health system at the moment. It's helped us create massive breakthroughs in our health and therefore our own human development. So it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's just a dominance of that paradigm that I will maybe call into question, because it's also led to reductionism. The process of breaking things down into simple component, and you who are interested in systems work kind of know this, but it's just a framing that I'm kind of bringing here. That, you know, a duck is a very complex thing, and then we try to understand it by pulling it apart and kind of making it into something else. So that's kind of part of the framing of where we are and what we're doing. And kind of like, I like going back when I do work, it's kind of go back to the why, go back to the why do we need to understand this in order to move forward into the what and the how. So worldviews can inform how we understand systems. So I know I'm talking to a geeky audience here. So sometimes when I talk to different boards or to different groups here, I'm assuming you are people who are systems or people who are interested in geeky into systems. So this is not always the way we come across. Sometimes we get a bit more practical, we get a bit more working on issues. Tonight, I'm going into geek zone a little bit, if that's okay with you. And there is a mechanical worldview of systems as well. Systems are hard systems we can know a system, right? We can draw a system, they're closed, they create an objective truth. So when we have a map of a system, we can know it. And engineering sort of concepts use hard systems and systems. There is a cause and effect, and we might draw that cause and effect not as linear. We might draw that in a more systemic way, a more systems way, about maybe drawing out the system. But it still comes from a worldview that is perhaps still connected to the Newtonian. It's trying to stretch the Newtonian worldview, and it's trying to ask itself, saying, well, what does it mean to see this as a system? But it still has some qualities there that are still closed and known and drawn. And that's where system mapping sometimes can be like, we can over capture a system, we can overdraw it, and we can say, we just need to know. And a lot of people who come to us and say, could you help us with the system map? They're like, we need to know the system. Like, great. That has a really big benefit, and it helps people, and it helps them on their journey, and it helps them get out from maybe a linear mindset. And it's on that first step for me, and it's really beneficial, but it's not the full gambit. In comes complexity. It adds a more softer, a more social dimension. It breeds critical thinking. So when you use complexity from a management, from a social science perspective, it says that people are part of this system, you know, that we need to understand that it's socially constructed, that they're open systems, that, you know, the complexity works on the idea of open systems, that that therefore we don't really know the system, it's how you hold the system, what you look at it. So that the soft system methodologies also fit very well with some of the complexity theory idea. And the idea that, you know, complexity is the non-linear version. How do we look at that? But for me, there's also, which is part of this, is living systems actually sometimes looks at the subjective and the objective. It looks at things as a continuum. It kind of tries to capture life and tries to capture the wholeness of life. And I'll come back to this term, what is wholeness as well. It creates regenerative ideas, which I'll come back to as well, about the capacity to regenerate. It also has this kind of critical reflectivity about it, like it asks us to be critical and reflective, and I'll say why in a moment, and is connected to some of the spiritual dimensions actually of systems work. And I'll say why I think it is connected to the spiritual dimensions as well. So that's a bit of the framing, is that we sometimes in systems worlds think that systems worldview is one worldview, but actually there's multiple worldviews in systems world. And this is not all of them, this is just some. But the first thing I would like invite us to do is pay attention to what is our worldview when we're talking about systems work, and which worldview you're coming from, and how does that inform the work that we do.
So someone's posted a pluriverse.
The pluriverse, yes.
Not the metaverse, it's the pluriverse.
Not the metaverse, or as I've been watching a lot of Marvel with my children at the moment, not the multiverse of space-time continuum that Loki opened up into the world, but I won't go off on that one. But yes, the pluriverse, and even this week I was talking to somebody about the polycrises and how this is a new word entering our lexicon in change world, like the fact that these crises are crossing over, that, you know, what's happening in Ukraine is also working on kind of climate change and oil and all these. We started to realize a lot of these crises and what's happening in the Antarctic is connected to governance issues. So these idea that these metaverses or these polyverses or these polycrises, and how they're all, you know, I think living systems is trying to get into the fact that we're trying to work with all of these, the wholeness of all of that. And how do we go about doing that? What does that start to look like? Don't have the full answer tonight, but I give you little snippets of how I perhaps and how we kind of start looking at it. So what are some of the principles from a living systems perspective? So the first principle of living systems, and this comes from work of Fritjof Capra and others, many others as well, is this idea of multi-level fractals. The structure of a system is that it works in this wholeness, these fractals of multi-levels. So on the left-hand side here, this is a brain cell, and this is the universe, right? And they're very similar. So there's also something about the structure of the way the world works is in this network pattern as well, that a lot of these patterns are repeating themselves, and they're happening at these repeating nested fractals, right? They're repeating themselves. So this is kind of the structure of reality, is almost a living system says, that these patterns repeat themselves at these multi-levels, and there's something about the quality of wholeness to these, that there's something that's whole about them. And this is where in systems work we start talking about what is the openness of a boundary, what's the closedness of a boundary. So you can say, well, there's a hole, so that's a boundary, but it's also open, so it's closed and it's open. So working with both those ideas. So that's kind of one of the first principles, is the structure of the system is this multi-level fractal or wholeness, nestedness. Different people use different terms. The second one is that we need to see things as a pattern of relationships. And that seems obvious when we do systems mapping or network mapping. But often when we look at this, we look at the trees and the river and the mountain, and actually we forget to say we're not looking at the flow of the water, the flow of the resources. And we still couch things as the nodes in the relationship, not the relational dynamic of what's happening. And that's a really big mental shift that we need to make in living systems, that it's the exchange that becomes more important. So the conflict is an exchange is more important than the two people in conflict, as an example. And so we pay attention to the relational dynamics more in living systems than actually the nodes that are relating. And that really is important with living systems when we talk about terms such as resilience, because resilience in a system is where you have a multitude of diversity of relationships. So the more relationships we have, the more resilient the system is, the more, as Donietta Meadow calls, the more the platform on which it operates has a wider range to be working on. So relationships and the diversity and distribution of those relationships are really important. But just the simple thing of can we start seeing in relational dynamics, not in what is the relationship between A and B. So A and B becomes less important than what's happening between them. So that's kind of the second principle or idea of living systems that I bring. The third one is that, and I think this goes, it's ever evolving. So you said it's evolving. The system is evolving, it's moving, it's continually in process. And that process is led by the concept of self-organization, the idea that a system is organizing itself. Now, something I really liked when I learned about this was that, you know, the earth in itself, there is no a way. The earth is almost, it is to some extent, it is a closed system, but it's not, because it has sunlight coming in. So it has energy entering into that system. And what that energy does is it's putting more energy, well, it's putting more energy in the system. And this is driving it towards novelty, towards innovation. So those of you who work in innovation, it's driving it to say, well, what do we do with this energy? I mean, it's very simple. Like the world is going, what do we do with this energy? And it's creating almost more complexity. It's creating novelty. Where that novelty comes about, it creates new relationships. And it kind of goes, well, we need to reorganize ourselves. And emergence is the reorganization of that self-organization into a new whole pattern. So these things come connected. The structure, the pattern, and the process of emergence or self-organization sort of work as a trio of kind of working together in a living system. So that's quite a complex thing to understand, because it took me quite a while to understand that. So there's a structure of the system of how you see it in kind of nested holes, that they're all related, the things within that, in that network. So this is still, they're all relating to each other. The neurons are firing in the brain. And that that all structure will start changing as more energy is coming into that. It will be innovating, it will be changing, it will be moving, until it almost can't deal with what it's doing. The relationships move, and that self-organization creates into the process of emergence, the movement of the next order of complexity or system. And that's evolution as well. So all these things and ideas of living systems, how they work together. So those are kind of some of the ideas and principles of living systems. The final one, and I put there, is consciousness. And the reason I put that there, because your point about people, we are people, and the reason why we're interested in this is because we're people, and we can self-reflect, we can understand these ideas. But it's really important because we have the ability to self-reflect and choose the actions we make. We have the ability to see the past, to work into an intention into the future. We have the ability to do that. And consciousness for me is an emergent property of the system's complexity. Our brain in itself is just an emergent property of complexity. But it also gives us a quality, an emergent property in the system to operate a bit differently. We have the ability to choose how we create change, what we do. And as a complexity theorist I work with, Jean Bolton, talks about, is what we put into the system becomes the system. So this is why worldviews, again, intentionality, the way we think is really important, because what we start creating, what we put into every action, every design, every system, everything we do starts to become that system. The means never justify the ends, because the means create the ends, right? So there's something in that. Yeah, go.
Where does chaos like fit into that? Because entropy and
yeah,
we're all chaos is the ultimate end, and how does that affect the system in some way, shape, or form?
It does. Chaos is almost like an edge behavior. I'm not an expert on chaos theory, so I'm going to know that I could trip over myself massively here. So from my understanding of chaos is it's almost a system at the edge of complexity, and it's not a way to organize it. So there's always the in kind of living systems, there's always an edge beyond. So you kind of, oh, we can capture these principles, this is how it all works. And then there's chaotic behavior, and we don't know what's going to happen beyond that.
There's also the idea of the edge of chaos, isn't there? So that kind of tension between organisation and disorganisation, and it's upon that balancing point, perhaps, that living systems are delicately walking. That they found that line that is the edge of chaos.
Well, they're constantly trying to work with edges, right? So edges and liminal spaces is kind of like they go into chaotic, but there's almost a process which is self-organisation, the novelty, the chaotic, that they're trying to say, well, how do we reorganise around this? How do we kind of create a structure? So the balance of emergence is structure. And then you go back to the structure of the multifractal, And that then creates, you know, a structure for a while until the processes and patterns of relating then creates more. So there's something in that, but you're right, there's chaotic, that's also, it's not like it's all contained beautiful process either. So how does this inform how we create change? So worldviews matter for the process and outcomes of systems change, and I'll come back to what systems change is as well. And for me, this is important. You know, the first bit of understanding how systems work is great, but it doesn't mean anything unless it informs, for me, how we act and what we do in the world. So this is one of my favourite quotes, and we use it a lot in a lot of the work that we do. And it just acknowledges that the world is complex and it's ecological, social, psychological, economic. But one of the challenges is we treat it as if it's not. And we have created a lot of our structures and patterns and ways of working that make it separable, simple, infinite. So our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from the mismatch of the way, so this is the kind of the why, the way we see the world and the way we manage and operate and design and innovate and in that world. It's trying to kind of not work with the living systems nature of it. It kind of trying to almost catch it too much. And there's some real benefits in it, but the key is knowing when to work with a living systems view versus perhaps more mechanical or complexity versus view, or others as well. So there's something, the reason why I do systems work is because of these global challenges, which is, I have a rejection sometimes to the activist title, because it's kind of, no, because it's like, but you're right, because I call my team Cultivate, because it has a more of a, which you'll see why, because it has a more of a living systems view than a disruptive view, but that in itself is great and fine. So putting systems change approach into practice is like an iceberg. So we talked about the iceberg or the pool table balls as well. A lot of the time we look for the systems tools and frameworks that are visible. We say, oh, how do we do that? And how do we capture this? And that's very much can come from kind of a routine. And frameworks are great. I love a good framework. But as long as we recognize that they are a lens in and they're just an improvement. All models are wrong, just some are more useful than others. And so, you know, as long as how do we bring a deeper understanding of the worldview that informs those use of frameworks, it informs the capabilities and the ways of being in the world that are slightly different. So frameworks are great, they're powerful tools, but actually, ultimately, we're looking at what are the systemic practices under the surface, the new ways of thinking and seeing the world. And I won't go into this in detail. We have mapped out a lot of different ways and systems practices, and this is our systems practice wheel that try to work with new ways of seeing the world, from how you identify and work with wholes, how you identify relationships and perspectives in that, and the relational bit, how you work with power and conflict, how you work with resisting forces, how you work over time, like the cycles of time, how you work to find interventions, and how do you create that adaptive approach and challenging your assumptions. So all those ways of working, you said at the beginning, are part of these systemic practices, okay? So turning those kind of, oh, we need to work in cycles. Oh, we need to work with conflict and power dynamics. Okay, we need to work with people and their perspectives and how they see the world. These are all systemic practices that are part of the change work that kind of underpin any frameworks or tools or capabilities or work that we do. So not too much more now. So systems change, kind of looking at those principles of living systems. Is this emergence of a new pattern or of organization, a new pattern or a system structure? And we can understand that as two things, either the process by which we're continually creating change. Sometimes systems change, people think, is the shift of that pattern. We want systems change. What they're meaning by that is we want this outcome. We want a shift in the structural pattern of, and that, for me, isn't necessarily a living systems perspective, because actually a living system perspective will say we want a continually changing system. We want to actually work with the way the living system works. So we need to integrate both the process orientation of systems change and the way we do things, as well as the outcome. And the outcome in itself is a continually evolving thing as well. So going back to the three worldviews I said, how do they inform the process of change? So the first one really is like, we need to find the levers for change. We need to find the outcome, we need to create the change we want. Again, This is not critiquing it. It's saying it's a different worldview, and it has its benefit and it has its place. I'm just asking the question of what does it mean when you take on a living systems perspective when you do that. So innovation and solutions are needed for the system. The system needs some innovations. We need to scale those innovations up. We need to make them part of the system. We need to shift the incentives, the blockage to those innovations, okay? Great, some amazing work can be done in this space. And there are some solutions and problems that need that. A complexity worldview says, how do we create multiple experiments? We don't know what's going to take off. We don't know what the system's going to need. We need to spot the signals of change. We need to understand where things are happening. We need to probe the system. We need to disrupt it. We need to support the experimentation. We need to continually learn and adapt to what's happening in the system. And we scale out through connecting. So scaling becomes a process of the connecting. The innovation platform is more important than the innovation itself, the multiplicity of things, the relationships, the network dynamics that's happening there. So there's a kind of a worldview which is slightly different. And so change, and these are not mutually exclusive either, but I will come to the third one about living systems. What it does do to our change work is we usually prioritize a lot more of these levers for change as our approach to change. And we don't support as much of these two approaches. So in my view, we need all of them. But what happens is with a living change perspective, so this is living with change. So this is the framing of we're not just changing, we're living change. We're living with it. We're living with the living system. This gets into the spiritual domain. You know, when I said the living systems has a spiritual domain, because it's got consciousness to it. It works from essence. And that's a bit of a hippy-dippy word sometimes. What does that mean? Working from potential, from evolutionary purpose. These are some of the words. Working from the wholeness of that. The word wholeness comes in here as well. What does it mean to work with the whole of the human being or the deepness of that person? So a lot of systems change work comes from some of this space, this kind of spiritual work that is also part of it, because it's trying to get to the nature of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be Anna? What does it mean to be us as people? How do I find my potential and the potential of the system to create change? A key strategy for living change is cultivating the capacity for evolution. And this is where regenerative thinking is really important as well. Like why regenerative practices, I think, are kind of having a renaissance as well, which is the capacity of the system to continually self-organize is actually more important than the outcome that you're creating. You're putting, like even the word sustainability, the ability to sustain, or the ability to regenerate, I think is more important than the actual outcome you're trying to create sustainability. Has the system got the ability to continually evolve? What does that look like? So focusing more of our changeover on the capacity of what that is. And that means we need to put in the conditions for change. We need to put the enabling conditions for change and the ways of organizing, the ways of relating. And I work in this space for 20 years, as Joss sort of pointed out. Getting funding for relational work, really difficult. Saying that the relational time together of having a laugh or a joke is just as important for me as sometimes some of the hard outcome work, change work. And that is really difficult for people to value that. So part of my argument here isn't to say that this work isn't important. It's saying that we also need to value this work, because this work is working with the living systems, living change perspective. And we need learning that is developmental, that is continual. Although this afternoon with my work on curriculum, maybe even developmental learning was being challenged for me. But the idea that it's part of a continuum, it's part of these cycles, and then perhaps in different cultures and contexts, it might be different as well. So these are some ideas that are sort of stimulating. How do you say, well, what is a living systems work? And how does that start to change the way we think about the nature of the work that we do, from our worldview into the actions that we might take? And the final thing is, it also does inform the outcome and the goal that we're seeking. So the outcome of a system, this is a piece of work we did with Regenesis, a regenerative organization, that working with wholes, working with the idea of potential, saying that the ultimate goal of the system isn't a goal in itself. It almost disrupts the idea, a goal that becomes the process. The idea that a goal is about regeneration, about continually moving, a regenerative work. So it starts to move from the idea that a goal is we need to do good, we need to create resilience in the system, kind of outcomes, to actually saying we need to create the ability for life to express itself, for life to live itself. And that this idea of regenerative work kind of starts to help us work in that direction. And at Forum for the Future, we did add the word justice in there because there's something about the need to recognise the kind of the process of healing of systems of the past as well. So how do we create, build the capacity for that justice and regeneration? So this work, it doesn't just change the process, it does actually also change the outcome that we're seeking as well. So that's me. I'm happy for questions. We have programs running at the moment that work from these perspectives and ideas of base camp programs, working with investors from foundations through to impact investing. We're working on stuff in healthcare at the moment. These are just the open programs at the moment. And we also run a number of different series on thematic or bespoke learning programs, taster sessions. We run stories of change sessions, and we also do kind of more coaching projects. My colleague Sean here also does a lot of our in-program, in-house coaching work as well. So that's me. Thank you very much. And I'm really up for the discussion in the room, online. I hand over to Joss in terms of how he wants to manage the next bit.
Great. We've got people asking for resources to go a bit deeper on this. Would it be possible to have a link to go deeper on the different systems perspectives? I think is that a couple of slides.
Yeah, I can send a few articles.
Yeah, I'll share that. Okay, maybe you want to take a chair, or you can stand if you want. Yeah, maybe we open up some room. Just some thoughts for myself. So I was a bit caught up in the kind of technical stuff there, but there's one that really popped out for me because I think about it a lot. You know, it's this thing of trying to shift people's focus to kind of endogenous thing about the system dynamics instead of the outcomes. Like that's the thing I find so kind of pops up everywhere for me. Like it seems like everything's focused on the out. We want to get to this place. We want to get sustainable development goals. We want to reduce poverty by 25. And we forget about the system, don't we? Yeah. I think you're getting at that. And that's kind of what system change is really about. So like the healthy idea, you introduced that a lot. How healthy is the system? What's the dynamics in it? What's the infrastructure, really, rather than what can we get out of it?
Well, if you pay attention to what you put into it, what will come out to it will take care of itself. So it's not saying you don't care about the outcome or care that the outcome is going in a direction of intention towards just and regenerative goals, but you're not paying attention to kind of the direct linear pathway, or even the pathway to get there of your even if the curve isn't linear, you're paying attention to what you're doing now, and you're trusting that what you're building in the system now will, because of the process of living systems, will evolve the system into what you want. And it doesn't mean you can't think big. It doesn't mean you can't think infrastructure or whole organizationally, but it's not trying to map everything out into the future as well.
And I think it so easily goes back into that, doesn't it? Like, well, I used to have that challenge when I'm teaching people, but things like sustainable development goals or mission-driven orientation, this sort of, it's like, sounds great, yeah, I love it, but it so easily fits back into the box of, well, here where we're going, and let's just focus on, we've got to get the rocket to the moon sort of stuff, right? Yeah. We should just focus on that, and we've got to, it goes back to the same old kind of management, right? We've just got to control the parts and get them to work together to our plan to get there, and we forget about the system again, don't we? And it's like, you have to keep on kind of focusing people back and say, no, it's actually about the system, right? It's about how that's working, the dynamics, and you touched upon the kind of creative tension, isn't it? And emergence. I don't think you mentioned that word, but it's all about that, isn't it? It's like
it is.
The endogenous dynamic of the system, how healthy it is, resilient, and so forth, so that it can create those outcomes kind of organically through emergence that we want, right?
And I'll give you an example of why it can be dangerous, because we've got things like by 2030 on climate change, we must reach X goal. But what happens is we kind of then go, oh, it's 2020 and we've got 3 years and we'll sort it. And that's been happening. I've been working in climate change also for 20 years. That's always been happening. We kind of look for a 10-year goal.
Then reduces down.
And actually we go, it's urgent. We haven't got time to do this stuff now, the deep stuff now. We just need to do it. I'm like, well, the deep stuff will create the change actually quicker. It will tip the system quicker. Then, so this urgency deep tension is a massive, I find it fascinating, of kind of like, we haven't got time to go deep, so because it's so important and urgent for the next 10 years. But almost by having a 10-year time horizon, that's not very living systems, because it's kind of saying we can map out the next 10 years. It's like, well, that's not how the Arctic and the Antarctic are working right now. They're not thinking about 10 years. They're going exponential right now. So, and their temperatures are going a bit nuts. And so it's almost like, how do we mirror that and go, what's the deep change work we do today, now, we're putting into the system? It's a really difficult question.
And it's so seductive, that way of thinking, isn't it? So you come up with a nice idea. 2030, we're going to reduce this or increase that or whatever, and then to get funding, right? That's quite often why you do it, isn't it? And to get back in and so forth, and then to shift everyone's thinking to, let's not think about that, let's think about the system, right? And quite often the system looks like a mess, so no one really wants to look at it, right? They want to think about, oh, it's a mess, but we'll get here by 2030.
And it doesn't mean you can't think big, right? So Denmark in the 1970s decided to change the whole infrastructure of energy to, and it's infrastructure, it's not a software problem, it's a hardware problem. They changed to renewable offshore wind, right? So they changed a lot of their system. They're not reliant on Russian. It's been in the media recently because they're not relying on Russian oil at the moment, which is obviously a big issue for now. And it's not saying that you can't do these big hardware challenges or these big visions. And that's a vision. They didn't know how long it was going to take to get off Russian oil, but they knew in the 1970s that they wanted to do that. So it doesn't mean by acting urgency now, it's almost that you can have a bigger vision and going, oh, we can't do that by 2030. It's like, well, we've got to do it. Like, we've got to get off oil. So we've got to go, even if the infrastructure problems take 20 years to do it, we have to do it. And so it both also frees you up from really long-term planning, you know, without kind of this time horizon.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm a bit exercised about that.
Yeah. I think it's really just getting away from the linear thinking, isn't it? We're here or we can just go there. It's not, I've thought about it quite a bit. It's not that it's wrong to think about the nice world that you want to live in, right? You still want to think about that, but the path from here to there, you can't know that, right? There's a whole kind of, it's got to be non-linear, right? It's got to be the whole system and developing that and the interrelationships between the parts and structure and resilience and health and so forth that would ultimately lead you there. So you don't actually know the pathway to there, and it goes all over the place, and that's reality, isn't it? Like you come up with these plans where you say, right, I'm going to go here, and if it's complex at all, it's always like, okay, things are going fine, then bam, it goes all over the place, right? And that's kind of reality. Whenever you're doing something complex, so if we could just start with that recognition that this thing's complex, and all those kind of principles you put up there, right? If we start with that recognition, and then start thinking about how do we actually work with that mess. Recognize that up front instead of it being, a surprise when it comes to launches. So
isn't that about the inputs? When you have that complexity, isn't it that if there's certain inputs that you can control, that you can put in, that may make that system change, that by doing one thing really well and putting a lot of resources in, instead of trying to spread it out over 100 different things, concentrate on one thing which will hopefully flip the whole system to be able to do that.
Yeah, hopefully. So I agree with you, and it doesn't mean that one person can't say I'm going to invest massively in this one thing that I think will flip the system, but the ultimate systems need flipping in multiple ways. Like you can't flip the system with one strategy. I think China's been the only place that's demonstrated how much they do that, and we don't live in a regime that like that. And they have the ability to do it.
I guess there's the function of the system as well, because that means if we're talking about flipping the system, as I think about, and you've got to have a definition of what good is, and that's quite nefarious, isn't it? So to say I'm going to flip the system, so that I want to change what the function of the system is, well, you could have a perfectly functioning, healthy, balanced system that we could categorise as being evil and wrong. Yeah.
Yes.
So.
Well, and it depends what values. What do you mean by healthy, right? So what values are part of healthy? That's why justice has to come in there as well. Like so, therefore.
There's this kind of subjective, and then how do you bring the multi-perspective? I mean, I almost feel like when I view it, so I think a lot about. I work in AI, and we are potentially building the next level of emergence. We are sort of semi-unconsciously building. Busying away to build the next system. We tend to think of evolution has taken us to this point. We've arrived at humanity. All right, that's it. It's all over now. There's the whole emergence thing. But blatantly, it's not. We're building the next thing above us, not above us, but with the next level of emergence. But then, if we're not teaching that a notion of what good looks like, if we're just basically teaching it or make as much money as you possibly can,
so what you're putting into the system is the value of money is the most important thing for this system to evolve by. So that's the principle. So just to use that example, the principle of what you're doing is AI is to make money. I know there's a lot of other reasons. And therefore you're creating, that's my point about what you put in the system becomes a system. You're just perpetuating a worldview of growth, money, orientation, which actually isn't, it might not be then changing the deeper paradigm of the system. So AI has it could be value neutral, but we're not putting values into the way we're designing it and the way we do it. So that's the question about, is it a healthy system if it maybe creates massive injustices, or and then that's why I put the word consciousness there. It's the reflective ability to choose what we're putting as the DNA to every intervention.
Actually, I'm just in a project with my students that is kind of trying to introduce VR as the long-term solution to a lot of problems within the care sector, so caring for the elderly. And oh my goodness, you just showed me something that kind of went, oh my goodness. We did a mapping session. I like to do kind of hands-on in a studio, messy on a massive wall, and they were mapping the system around. And basically, they came to the point where they had to kind of recognise, okay, what are the connections? And then the design students who are kind of from a classical design background just saw this is connected to this and this is connected to this. And the one student who's come from a social sciences background said, but actually what happens if we go into dynamics, and actually kind of elaborated on it. The whole group just kind of sat down and it came back to that kind of spiritual side of it. And I'm even looking at it, I'm like, we're so easily going to the kind of linear approach, even as designers, where we say, be process driven, don't be task driven, follow this pattern, be adaptive. I talk all the time about hyperactability and hyperactability, right? And then equally, the students who get it, when they're faced with complexity, they're very go to their comfort zone of things. So going back into VR, this one student was hypercritical because she was saying, well, if we put it in, it becomes part of the system and then feed it into the system, but we haven't done anything with it.
Yeah,
what's going to happen? So, but there's something about that spiritual side of the post-quantitative and integrating that into the structure. Yeah. So I've really got to see that.
If we could try to speak up for the sake of the audience here. Actually, Lydia Hascott, who you probably know, has a question. She's mentioning here actually just what we're talking about, but also who gets to determine what healthy means, which is kind of what we're talking about. Who gets to
decides who decides?
Yeah, who gets to define what just and regenerative mean? Come back to power. And when I teach this stuff, often you're teaching kind of tools and stuff, the multi-level perspective, loops and stuff, and you do that for a long time, and then ultimately you hit up against the question. Someone asks, then that's fine, but there's a question of values here, isn't there? So sometimes, yeah, you get confused because tools are somewhat neutral. It's like anybody could be using that two-loops thing or multi-level thing, but ultimately there is a question of values here. Like you can't do it without values. It's always going to be there.
And there is something in living systems that does say what's healthy, though, right? So living systems there are systems that we're currently creating an economy that's not healthy. It's functioning, but it's not healthy because it's creating runaway climate change. So healthiness is also about wholeness in living system. It's also about, is it contributing to the system its greater whole? When it's not better, it's just greater whole. And so what's happening is a lot of the economy in sustainability, we often talk about the economy, society, environment, very simple. We've often talked about it as 3 pillars. They're not 3 pillars, they're nested. And the unhealthiness of our economy, and this is what Daniela Meadow talks about, is we've created a growth mindset within the economy. And it's very resilient economy. We had the financial crash. It bounced back. It's got a lot of diversity of relationships. In some ways, you could say that's very healthy. But also, it's very unhealthy because it's not, healthiness is also paying attention to its greater whole. And ultimately, the greater whole is our ecology and the health of our planet. And all indicators on social and environmental now are, a lot of those inequality measures, injustices, and then atmospheric, biosphere, marine, they're not going in a great direction. So therefore, the economy isn't healthy, or whatever subsystem isn't healthy, because actually, ultimately, our planet isn't healthy. So therefore, no system is healthy right now because it's not working for that greater whole. And that's my activism in your body coming out, but yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it depends on the boundaries of the system, because if you, so obviously all the systems are in this even more, even beyond the Earth, the living, we live in Earth, so we live in the universe.
Yes.
We can extend the system till the limit that we want. But if you ask the typos of US about the capitalism, it is a very healthy system for them. So, and I think it's a matter of perspectives and boundaries of the system, because we put the boundaries of the system, the capitalism and the rich people.
I'm saying that from a living systems perspective, no system is healthy unless the ultimate system is healthy, which is our living system. So that is the view of living systems, is that it is from their perspective healthy, but it has got, so this is my point about the spectrum, that systemic work sometimes is very subjective, but with the object subject coming in for living systems, there is an objective truth that our overall ecological system is very unhealthy right now.
But then the subjective is important as well, which is a thing where the consciousness comes in, because then it's like if you reflect in on yourself and actually spend time to go inside, then what you do inside reflects on yourself out. Like, you know, not to pick on somebody, but if Donald Trump just kind of spent a bit of quiet time looking in on himself, and you know, there's probably some, and so it is for President Putin, if they spend a bit of time reflecting, you can't, like, if you spend enough time, I don't think.
Yeah,
I think it would be hard then to act in that.
Well, I think what you're just to try and tie a few things together, and the way it's making sense to me is reflecting is kind of connecting with something broader than yourself, isn't it? Right? And I think the word we haven't used is sustainability, which is kind of what you're saying, which is kind of the measurement of healthiness, and like in a holistic context. This relationship between the system and its environments, and that is actually a metric of how well it's doing, like in this holistic way. Like in the narrow way, if we give that example of China, they're just focused on, okay, how much can we grow our GDP? How efficient are things inside the system? Kind of analytical view of it. But what we're talking about here, the health, is more about the relationship with its environment and how long it's going to endure.
Exactly. So there is a specific healthiness is defined in living systems as the health of the whole, and therefore the health of the whole is the health of us all.
And how much it can sustain itself is the health. You know, how long it can sustain.
Well, sustain. So I actually, now I've worked in sustainability for 20 years. This is why the word sustain, because we've way gone over the ability to sustain ourselves now. So it's actually, sustaining means the regenerative ability of ourselves. So the capacity of ourselves to continue to evolve. But then you've got into really deep spiritual questions about what's the purpose of life, like, because that is our purpose. And then we can talk about, relate that to AI, and, you know, then that is value judgments about what's the purpose of us being here.
Yeah, so regenerative connects to it, doesn't it? A healthy system is a regenerative one.
Yes.
An unhealthy one is a degenerative one, isn't
Yes.
it? And it has to be regenerative to be sustainable, to
Yes.
sustain itself over time.
I don't know, sustainable, because you can have sustainable in particular ways where a process can be sustainable, but actually be unhealthy.
Yes.
And so I don't know if sustainability can actually be seen as a healthy parameter.
But it's the context you're looking at, isn't it?
No, it is. But people can only see their own context. Trying to get people to expand their context beyond what they see as sustainable. As a consumer society, we may see this as sustainable.
Yeah, but that's what systems thinking is about, isn't it? It's about expanding our awareness of the systems we form part of, so that we might ultimately get something that's more sustainable instead of our actions. Our limited focus. Okay, anyone else want to ask questions? Comment? Time for more drinks. Okay, that's your priority. I get you on it. Okay, so do you want to wrap up there? Yep.
You spoke at the beginning about the Newtonian paradigm, which sort of set the precedent for linear thinking. To what extent do you think the reason that people generally think that way is a result of that sort of being how we're taught? I guess you could ultimately discern that from that Newtonian paradigm versus just something innate about human nature, where we just naturally think sort of from.
Yeah, there's two things going on here. One, we're born systemic thinkers. We're born with an understanding of complexity, and actually our education system is a product of industrialization in the process that has actually taken systemic ability out of us. So there is innate. I was listening to something to Nora Bateson today. She's saying we're not teaching people complexity. We're creating the conditions by which they can see the complexity around them, right? So it's in us. So when you start designing, how do you design from that viewpoint? I can't remember my second point, but so there's almost saying that the new, and we have also been socialized and educated in the innateness of us about the linearity. And we also have brains that can't constantly think complex, chaotic way, right? So we need to create structure. We need to create models and things. And reductionism really helped us do that when the world was getting really complex. And it was brilliant. And it's done some amazing things. So I'm not saying that being reductive, I'm really pleased that every time I go to open a door, I don't have to think about opening it and bring my conscience to it. I'm really pleased that there's things that work naturally for me. I'm really pleased that there are things that work quite linearly. And I'm pleased working in health. I'm working in health at the moment. When a doctor knows how to do one thing when I'm in an acute ward, and that's what happens. When we're talking about preventative care, when we're talking about looking at the health of the whole system, I don't want them to be like that. I don't want a doctor to then make decisions based in that way. So I think it's the innateness is both and, right? We are innately complex and we can understand it. And we are innately need simplicity and structure to help us work with that complexity. The question is I think that's got out of balance. So it's not the Newtonian paradigm is completely wrong. It is the dominance of it and the overriding nature of it that I think is the challenge, not that we're going to get rid of it and exclude it completely. So it's yes and. So a living system perspective for me is always a bit yes and.
Okay. That's an
Hey,
hour.
with that?
Yeah, that's an hour. It's already 7:30, so maybe wrap up there and take some drinks. It's a great presentation. Thank you very much, Anna.
Pleasure.
Really,
Thanks for the
rich
invite.
discussion, lots of ideas there. Yeah.
Thank
Cool.
you everyone from online.